Okay, right. So, um, I mean, we know why we're here. We'll just get into it. First of all, then let's start off with introductions. So, Moira, do you want to go first?
Yeah, I am NeoMoirai. I stream mostly card games, Hearthstone, Shadow, things like that. I recently started getting back into streaming, and then today has just been like a hell of a week. I feel like I fucked myself raw last night just by staying up so late. So I don't know. And been dealing with a lot of family things. But aside from that, you can find me on Twitter. I am at OmniFeudalism, and I am here to support super awesome and cool liberal socialism.
Okay, no worries. Your mic is kind of roboting a little bit. I don't know exactly what's happening, but
Ooh,
maybe it's a connection or something. I don't know.
probably. I have shit connection. Let me see.
Okay, well, while you try and get that sorted out, Zuma, I'll throw it over to you. Do you want to go ahead and give an introduction?
Yeah, so I'm Zoomer Nation. I'm an anarchist YouTuber, and I guess you can find me on Twitter at Sarma slash Aaliyah Zoomer Nation. So yeah, that's my introduction.
Okay, great, good stuff. Right, so I think we agreed we're going to just do opening statements to kind of lay some stuff out. Um, was there any preference on kind of who wanted to go first, or did anyone want to see the other person to go first, or?
Um,
I don't mind whoever wants to start.
I was
Okay,
gonna say
well,
Zoomer if you want to go first.
okay then, Zuma. Do you want to go first? It's 5 minutes tops. Okay, you can use as much of the time as you want, or as little as the time as you want. Go ahead, and I'll let you know if you go over. Okay, go.
Yeah, sure. So I reject liberal socialism in favor of anarchism for two fundamental primary reasons. First of all, liberal socialism affirms the perpetuation of a state apparatus. I think it's unethical. I think it has an unethical monopoly on violence. I think that it exists to reinforce private sector capitalism and exploitation. I think that it'll always be alienated to the interests of the masses and the people that it's supposed to serve. I think that furthermore, I reject markets and market economies because I think that it doesn't set out to accomplish what it says it does. For example, it claims to promote innovation, but at the same time, it perpetuates sameness and the same products because it wants reliable, testable products. So it won't take risks because of the supply line and the incentive to stay safe and you know supposedly, there's like tons of money invested in people that are out there researching and trying to find the right product. But at the end of the day, you look at every product in every conceivable area. It's like the same thing. There isn't a significant amount of innovation. Furthermore, it's very alienating. Market economies alienate individuals from the products of their own labor. It alienates them from each other because this sort of anarchist, the anarchy of production, the sort of atomistic individual, the you know failure to have a sort of unified cohesive collective identity. And I don't mean that in a sort of right wing sense. I mean it in a sort of species being and having solidarity with one another. And furthermore, I think that it's largely destructive because you're essentially going to engage in self-destructive activities because you want to expand the profits of your own firms. And so you might cut your own benefits. You might vote to cut benefits of other workers. And we've seen this play empirically in places such as Mondragon, which, to be clear, isn't a perfect ideal cooperative, but it has more of the features. And the reason why you cut your own wages and engage in these sort of self-destructive economic activities is because the interest is to maximize wealth for your own firm, your own individual firm. And I think that also, it's better to pool resources together instead of competition to create the best products. And I think that there's a good argument for why central planning on whatever level is more efficient and preferable to sort of markets um, because we've empirically seen even capitalist corporations incorporate planning in order to be more successful and produce more wealth and so forth. So yeah.
Okay, there we go. So you had a few minutes left, but that's always good to finish it a bit early. Moirai, do you want to go ahead and start your opening statement?
All right. We must decide if we want to focus on a society that believes in human rights, private property, and freedom of expression, as opposed to this vision often presented as an ideal utopian future in Bakunin's revolutionary catechism. Beneath the surface is a dire and drab notion of society that is nameless, without the need of personalia. No equality. That what does Bakunin equate with equality? Socially elected consuls will decide who achieves rights and what those rights are in Bakunin society. How mutual aid will flow not from a governmental system ensuring that individuals are kept cared for, but from councils that vote on what you require. That's not freedom from hierarchy, but freedom from individuality and personal choice. It doesn't rid the world of class struggle, it moves class struggle into a socio-political struggle, where what we now call cancel culture can ensure that you go hungry for the rest of your fucking life. I already know that not every anarchist believes in Bakunin, as each anarchist has their own synthesis of the thousands and thousands of scholars and writers who propose their own ideas. Everything from the notion that the passage of time itself is an unjust hierarchy, and we should return to a time where abstract thought and comprehension didn't exist. A time that, within the known historical record, has never existed, as even Homo erectus was known to use simple tools and start fires. So we can talk about David Graeber and his beliefs that markets started the creation of unjust hierarchies, or at least certain unjust hierarchies, such as patriarchal domination of society, based on his flawed observations of tribes. He considered indigenous people to Madagascar to be essentially the proto-form of mutual aid peace existing in states of relative normality and no complications since the beginning. This is a farcical fucking lie. The infighting among waves of Malagasy groups was persistent, forcing some of the oldest generations of settlers further into the forest, now called Vaimbes. Now, these wars were documented as taking by traits in the 6th century. Anarchism is opposed to unjust hierarchies, yet pop anarchy such as non-compete, we're told that everything and anything is an unjust hierarchy, despite being an individual who exposes a belief that, in a way, the government of Vietnam is justified in many of its actions. EJ also falls into the often far too typical trope of assuming that the world is a business. He assumes that we live in a post-scarcity world. In EJ's mind, it's only capitalism holding back RTX 3060s from being magically made on demand. Even worse is the trope of the semantical anarchist. Police are evil, governmental enforcing agents. But if we change the name to community protectorate, then we have effectively done a fucking anarchism in EJ's idea. Which is absurd to such a degree it could be parody. The question also needs to be asked, would the propaganda of the deed sparks the Great Revolution for anarchists to reclaim the workplace, land, money, and systems of government? What side of the glorious revolution will people like EJ fall upon? The anarchists who are taking back workplaces, which should be noticed are unjust hierarchies, or the side of their partner, Luna Oy, who's a devoted Marxist-Leninist? We must also ask the question of not what happens during the revolution, even ignoring the notion that such a revolution would likely be stopped within days by most nations, or simply by utter and complete incompetence to organize, as was the case with the Russian anarchists during the Red-White War. What would happen the days after? Do we tell seniors they no longer get pension checks, as those were issued by the treasuries, and both money and the treasury are an extension of the state, which is an unjust hierarchy? Do we cut off the flow of medications through the federal supply chain as the government has been erased until such a time that the appropriate worker council, which all society must agree per consensus decision, or else the motion could be tabled in the vote on medical distribution, is pushed back perhaps by weeks? What do we do about food spoilage, transportation, fuel distribution, or any of the thousands of other essential requirements vital to human survival in the 21st century? It's easy to say that we could feed individuals from food obtained from markets by appropriating those, but a recent study showed that a single person trapped in an average-sized American grocery store could survive a maximum of 50 years.
Okay, you've got 10 seconds left, so wrap it up.
Oh, that's about it.
Okay, cool. So we still got this buzzing sound. Someone in chat said it could be because you've got noise suppression on. So I don't know if you want to check that, but it's very difficult to like it's quite distracting.
No.
Oh, there we go. You fixed it.
Check that.
You fixed it. You fixed it.
Oh, cool.
Don't touch your mic. Don't touch your mic.
Yeah.
Okay. There we go. Right. So I guess I'll throw it over to you, Lindsay. But is there anything you want to respond to or address, and then we'll go from there?
Absolutely. So first of all, I think a pretty significant contingent of that argument is predicated upon non sequitur arguments. Like non-compete is like totally ridiculed amongst anarchists. Very few people, genuine anarchists, take him seriously because of his apologetics towards Marxism, Leninism, and because he doesn't believe in anarchism. Okay, he literally believes in concepts like workplace democracy, and some hierarchies are justified. We need to analyze hierarchies. It's just very few people take him seriously. And I think I just reject the way in which the argument was framed, because so many things are thrown in there which don't necessarily represent my position. There's contradictory perspectives in the anarchist community about time and how we organize production and so forth. I don't necessarily subscribe to Graeber's anthropology as it relates to markets. I just think that markets are not the preferable mode of economic organization. I mean, we talk about all these pragmatic issues. How about the millions of people who die annually under a capitalist economy? You affirm private property rights because of starvation, because of the failure to properly allocate resources. We've seen empirical, examples of anarchist principle-based, systems working fundamentally. Macnovia had 7 million people. It organized some of the most successful agricultural communes in that entire region. It had first secular quality education in a long time in Ukrainian history. This is not insignificant. We saw the syndicates in various European countries organize on a decentralized fashion to, build bridges and architecture in those regions. I think that based on the empirical evidence that we have, and I'm not a pure empiricist, of course, I'm not a socialism done left type, but based on the empirical evidence that we have, I would question capitalism. Like I said, millions of people starving to death, weak infrastructure in various countries through privatization. We see, production, in every area. Like I said, production is not the best quality it can be. We don't see the most innovation when you look at the suburbs and urban areas, because there isn't an incentive to innovate. There's an incentive to stay safe and not produce the best qualities. And individualism, we are cogs in a machine within the capitalist mode of production. We are simply seen as price indicators. We are not seen as unique individuals that can develop our full intellectual and cognitive capacities and capabilities. And I reject the idea of human rights and private property. Human rights fundamentally is granted by the state. Natural rights doctrine at the end of the day is simply a pretext to justify the state apparatus and coercive social contractual obligations. And I believe in emancipation. I believe in the full development of the human spirit, our capacities and so forth. But I don't believe in some God-given rights, some state-given rights, some natural rights. I think that's simply coercive. And I think that's what's truly undermining of the individual. As far as private property is concerned, I thought that we were arguing liberal socialism versus anarchism. At first I thought liberal socialism is not pro private property, but maybe I'm wrong. Private property is a means in which the wealthy can accumulate more surplus. It can accumulate more wealth through surplus value extraction. It's a way to subjugate the masses, and it is the undermining of the individual, because it's essentially pursuing abstract ends rather than fundamentally social, human, real ends. So it's replacing the concrete with the abstract. So I don't necessarily agree with the premise that private property is what we should seek. I love personal property. We have to make the distinction between personal property and private property, but they're not the same thing. And there's probably a few other points that I might have missed, but yeah, that'd be my response.
Okay, Moirai, there's quite a lot there. Do you want to go into it?
All right, let's see if we can break these down like Rem the Bath Boy and try to ground our axioms here. First of all, in terms of anarchist states that exist as syndicalist societies, a lot of people will point to the existence of the state that occupied in Ukraine that happened to collapse spectacularly after outside pressure from the Soviets. Now, the other one that's often mentioned is revolutionary Catalonia. However, the fact is that revolutionary Catalonia was a state that existed with the sole purpose of being stateless. It was founded by the syndicalists. And yet, despite lasting for only 3 years, was marked by a reign of terror and mass killing of anyone who was against the CNT. This was so extreme, even Emma Goldman was appalled by the absolute brutality of it. While anarchists did indeed set up workplace management, during the Civil War, scarcity, the indiscipline of the workers, and mostly their indifference to the cause pushed the same activists that were pushing for anarchist governments to demand fucking work labor camps. The anarchist justice minister Garcia Oliver initiated a program of concentration camps, and even the most radical anarchist groups started to advocate for forced labor. Now, the second idea that markets do not compel innovation, I would just like to say this. When it comes to innovation, I have yet to see any country, be it a communist country, be it an anarchist society, create something like the microprocessor, something that was developed by two engineers who used to be employees of Texas Instruments. Now, fundamentally, that has changed the world forever and keeps innovating and innovating and innovating to the point where we now have complex multi-core processors and that have super threads. So the idea that there's no innovation within markets, or that there's better innovation when it comes to state planned or socially planned markets, can be easily debunked by the fact that the Soviet Union was playing catch up for 6 years, trying to clone VAX processors that were already outdated. Now, and then to the last point, when it comes to personal property, I'll bring it back everything to Frederick Bastiat, who said that everybody has the right to private property. Now, nobody has the right to plunder private property. You have the right to own a house. You have the right to own the land, but you do not have the right to exploit that land.
Okay, Zuma, go ahead and
All right.
respond.
Okay, so we can start from the back. So we bring up Frederick Bastiat and his, assertions about, private property, and we don't have a right to plunder, resources and so forth. But his philosophy is used as a pretext and justification for the most repressive economic system and mode of production imaginable. And private property intrinsically necessitates the exploitation of laborers. It necessitates the not proper reallocation of resources because we're not operating with use value. So we're essentially depriving a lot of people of the things and the goods that they need. And furthermore, you brought up CNT-FAI, and there's a reason why I explicitly don't mention that anywhere in my previous statements, because I don't fundamentally consider it to be an anarchist project. And even at its, peak, it was a collaboration between anarchists and Marxists. And if you think that's a, sufficient, justification to call it an anarchist project, then the DPRK is an anarchist project, because when you look at the genesis of the DPRK and its historical, origins, it also had collaboration between Marxists and anarchists. It doesn't necessarily mean that it was an anarchist project. I think that it was a very workerist mindset that went into operating, Catalonia. I think that it was a very capitalistic mindset. As far as, your point about innovation, the innovation that went about in, market economies, I will grant you that there was a significant amount of innovation because we were negating, previous modes of production. We were going through industrialization. We have a new epoch ahead. And this is the reason why I think that there's limitations to empiricism, because empiricism is fundamentally just a post hoc justification for the existing social relations and the existing modes of production. If we use a purely empirical analysis, we'd be in the caveman era to this day, because we would argue that, this is a tested reality. This is what we can justify with certainty. I think empiricism needs to be mixed in with a sort of taking it back in, analysis. And what can we find with this sort of rational analysis? We find that there was still a significant amount of innovations that we can thank from, the state apparatus. A lot of the computers and technology that we use today is from state planning. And that isn't me affirming state planning. There's still a lot of, market mechanisms that went into play there. But like I said, we have to look back and also try to dissect the empirical reality. And what we find is that it's not necessarily the market that is producing this innovation. It's human beings, and their capacities that are producing these massive innovations. And I think that we're simply bringing liberalism in a sense to its logical conclusion by advocating for anarchism. We're, liberating individuals so that they can be their full, expressed creative self. We're allowing them to, have the socioeconomic capacity to fulfill many different, goals and obligations in areas. And so the reason why markets, produce this sort of innovation comparable to other systems is because I think that we moved closer as time progressed towards those anarchist axiomatic ideals, as we mentioned earlier, towards the idea of liberty and, true, genuine social justice and so forth. And I think that by liberating ourselves from the market, we're moving even further ahead towards the capacity for individuals to fully develop and express themselves by moving away from the capitalist mode of production, which was still preferable to previous modes of production. But yeah, you look at, firms like Walmart and, okay, I hate to bring up the People's Republic of Walmart, but I'll end with this analogy, okay? In the People's Republic of Walmart, they compare the corporation Walmart with other companies that went with a more Ayn Randian, sort of Hayekian sort of mindset about economics, subscribing to the, economic calculation problem and, believing that we need to decentralize and have different competing firms within a corporation to produce the most innovation. And that company that was competing with Walmart, the primary competitors went out of business. Walmart continued to perpetuate itself and grow through a significant amount of planning. And you could argue it's still, responding to market mechanisms, but I'd argue that this is demonstrative of the fact that we don't need a rigid, not rigid. This is demonstrative of the fact that we don't need a decentralized sort of pricing system. We can plan economies by, taking in inputs, and, we have massive computer technologies that can help us understand the, wants of consumers and so forth. And yeah, so that would be, I went in a bit of a tangent, but that would be my response.
Okay, so again, starting from the end and working backwards, in terms of the notion of using computers to plan out the actual ideas of what consumers would want or consumer trends, that fails to take into account what consumer trends would happen. Nobody saw the explosion that TikTok was going to have. Nobody predicted the explosion that Twitter was going to have. Nobody even predicted the explosion that Gmail or Google was going to have. Those were all based completely on corporate ideas of just going out there and seeing what's going to stick and what is going to happen. Now, in terms of people coming up with ideas as anarchists, there are some potential clues that you can make or comparisons that you can make to the GPL community. But the issue is that at the end of the day, almost every single open source program for social media or search is widely ridiculed. Look at DuckDuckGo. While it is surprisingly very, very privacy focused, its actual results.
Is it me or did she cut off?
No, she's something's happened.
Oh no.
Oh, you're back.
Oh, I am. Okay, cool.
Sorry, keep going.
So I was going. Okay, so let me get my train of thought here because I was on a giant ass rant and then I realized that my microphone got unplugged. So when it comes to the idea that you can't innovate within the current marketplace as it stands, or that there's little no innovation, or that you need to have a giant computer controlled mechanism to predict consumer trends. Yes, there is a modicum of predicting consumer trends, but the issue is that there's always new products that are constantly coming out and new startups that are constantly coming out that you cannot predict. No computer algorithm in the universe would have predicted the rise of Twitter. No computer algorithm in the universe would have predicted the rise of just basic things like smartphones. Back when the iPhone first launched, everybody laughed it off as it essentially just being a toy gadget. The point where Microsoft's CEO at the time, Steve Ballmer, said that nobody would actually buy one because it lacked a keyboard. Fast forward to today, where the iPhone is the second largest phone on the market. The first largest phones happen to be Android phones, which are completely touchscreen. Nobody would have predicted the idea of a complete all multi-touch touchscreen device. And I highly doubt that that would have come about in any sort of anarchist society. Now, we could talk about how there are ways where workers can sit around and think of ideas. But the truth is that Google has this. Google has a 3-hour period where you could sit around and just sort of brainstorm different ideas. And do you know what that has produced? It has produced Stadia, Google Plus, and Gmail. Now, out of all of those, one of them is a success. Everything else, including the Summer of Code, has resulted in complete failures or things that have been shut down because the user base has been entirely absent because there are still better competitors out there. So, and then the idea that anarchism is the ultimate end of liberalism, when we start off with the notion that anarchism doesn't endow anybody with special inalienable rights, it just endows somebody with a special personhood to be their own, but doesn't guarantee liberty or doesn't guarantee unity, I find that to be absolutely nonsensical.
All right. I guess we could start from the last statement that was made. So I think that, these abstract values like liberty, freedom, they're wonderful, but, how do you bring them into fruition? I think that anarchism best succeeds in doing that because it makes humanity unencumbered by abstract hierarchies and systems that want to perpetuate themselves rather than, be subordinate and satisfy the wants of every individual and, their own ends. And, human beings are also, freedom is also partially about being a social being, having a well-knit, strong community. That's part of the soul of the individual and being emancipated. And I don't think that capitalism and liberalism meets those ends at the end of the day. I think that it alienates human beings from their full capacities to be free because we're so separate, because there isn't a sort of cohesion and, there's a sort of anarchic quality. And I don't mean anarchic in, the positive sense that I'm describing. As far as Google is concerned, you said it as sort of a pejorative that Google has 1 out of 3 successful innovations. But when you look at the massive influence of Google as a corporation and, the market share, all the things that it's produced overall, I think it's unfair to I think that you're sort of justifying my position about, creating a system where we can even broader, expand that principal value of Google, of collaboration and, getting everyone's idea, except bringing it to a more totalizing level, to a totalizing degree. I think that actually is a justification for my position. And as far as predicting new trends are concerned, I think that's a non sequitur. I agree that, we can't predict new trends and new innovations and so forth, but computers can help us, synthesize and understand the wants of consumers. And we can have people, innovators and, communities as a whole try to bring to fruition new, new innovations and new things that, even further satisfy the wants and, further bring to fruition what consumers want. Because at the end of the day, even though these, new innovations come out of nowhere, like Twitter or, Google or Facebook or what so forth, they still are, a product of at least understanding the, the sort of embryo of understanding what a consumer desires. You need to, at least in your mind, consciously analyze, what do I think a consumer will want? What do I think that an individual will want? And in that sense, I don't think it's just sort of random, spontaneous. It came out of nowhere. I think that there is a sort of rational basis to it all. And I forgot to mention this earlier. This was to address an argument way back. You mentioned, how Magnovia collapsed. I completely agree with you that Magnovia did collapse. However, I think that we saw with Magnovia an empirically provable example of anarchist principles coming into fruition despite Western propaganda. It was a libertarian sort of project in its spirit and in its essence. We saw such, people were no longer starving there. We saw, like, there was one very successful agricultural commune called Rosa Luxemburg. It was very successful. There was so much going there. And so we can't really undermine that. And I do affirm the necessity for global revolution, in order to bring to fruition our wants and desires. Because if it's limited, Marx brings this up in the German ideology, if it's limited to a particular region, you're going to be forced to capitulate to private sector capitalism and the dominating global mode of production. You're going to essentially ultimately fold. And we saw this in previous Marxist projects. So I affirm that. I just think it's a good empirical, testable example of anarchist principles succeeding, along with numerous other examples. And so that would be
okay. Let's specifically address Magnovia.
The sound is back. The buzzing sound. I think it's the cable on your mic.
Oh gosh.
Any better?
No, it was perfect, and then it's no.
One second here. It might be my phantom power supply.
Let me see here.
Anything better?
Speak a bit more.
Oh, anything better going on?
It's not quite as
No,
bad, but it's
no.
still noticeable. And it is. It's if it was just a little thing, it would be fine. But it's quite noticeable. Yeah.
Oh gosh. Okay, hold on. Can you hear me, Chad?
Perfect. Perfect.
Perfect. Okay. Yeah, I think it's just because I have so many electronic devices that it just wants to interfere with this non-shielded cable.
It's all good.
Okay, but
Continue.
so anyways, let's talk about
Oh
Magnolia.
God. Oh no, it's gotten worse. You now sound like a robot. Oh my God, no.
No.
Speak a bit. Speak a bit.
Speaking a little bit.
Okay, that's good.
That's good. Okay.
Yeah, don't touch anything. Go.
So, okay, hands off, hands up. Not even gonna fawn on myself under the desk. That's okay. So let's address the topic of Magnovia surviving or being a perfect example. So anarchism, unlike capitalism, unlike socialism, unlike even communism, within the two autonomous regions where it was tried, after at least 3 years, they collapsed.
Yeah, sure. So this is what I mean by, exclusively looking at something from a empirical lens without trying to, make deductions based on what we see. So what can we come to the conclusion with when we see that Magnovia and these other anarchist autonomous regions collapse? We can come to the conclusion that, wow, these anarchist principles are really bringing to fruition a successful, productive, prosperous society. The only problem is it's so limited to these regions. So the conclusion should not be let's dump the baby out with the bathwater and not try to pursue, these ends. This answer to that should be we need a more internationalist approach. We need to, bring to fruition a really tangible means in which we can counter the capitalist economic mode of production and the military. And I don't think that the conclusion you come to is a suitable conclusion. The whole point of I don't want to sound pretentious as fuck, but the whole point of the Socratic method and dialectics is you look at a problem and and there's a grain of truth to it, and then there's also a sort of error or mistake to it. With this situation, we can come to the conclusion that yes, there's limitations, but at the same time, we can succeed if we take a new route. That's the conclusion I come to when I hear that.
So, on the basis that you don't think that we could use empiricism to automatically define if a state will work or not, or if a specific system will work or not, when I believe that fundamentally that assertion is absolutely false. If we've demonstrated that on at least 2 occasions, potentially 3, including if we're including worker co-ops in anarchist beliefs, then there are thousands of examples where every single time these things have failed. There's no potential way to start an anarchist society. Anarchism is a very great lens for analyzing society and analyzing what systems are just or not. But the basis that you can use it as a form of government without a worldwide revolution requiring bloodshed is absolute just pie in the sky fantasy dreaming.
Okay, so wait, so do you also reject worker-owned cooperative? Just to be clear.
I don't reject worker-owned cooperatives. I just find the idea that worker-owned cooperatives that don't have elective management boards to be utter failures because most of them are. Empirically,
so
look at the well, I was gonna say look at the Co-op Bank in England, which had to be bailed out, and now their primary owners are hedge fund managers.
Sure. You're claiming to make an empirical statement, but you gave an anecdote. Whereas I'd say that when you look at the totality of evidential data, there's many benefits to cooperatives compared to traditional firms. And these studies, include cooperatives in their totality, and that includes better resistance to price shocks. That includes a more happy and productive workforce, et cetera, et cetera. So if we're going to even incorporate worker-owned cooperatives to that label of anarchy or anarchism, I don't think that really justifies your position. And I think it's easy to say this is an abstract pipe dream. In the French Revolution, they probably would have said that, a few years prior. Are you kidding me? There's no philosophical pretext or basis for this movement. You're revolting spontaneously against this monarchy. You're trying to shatter this aristocracy. You could say it's a pipe dream, but I think that there's a complete rational basis of thinking that we can have global solidarity as we become more integrated, as a globe through multiculturalism and globalism. I can see how we can exploit the sort of contradictions and interests, how we can exploit the oppression and repression as a movement in order to bring forth revolution. I don't see that when you rationally analyze the current geopolitics and the environment. I don't see that as a pipe dream. I don't see that as irrational. I think that's conjecture on your part, to be completely honest.
Okay, so first let's address the French Revolution. The idea that everybody a few years prior would have said this is completely impossible, we wouldn't have been able to do that. The main example cited by most people in the French Revolution was the American Revolution. The idea that you could overthrow a monarchy and successfully become an independent nation on your own, that had empirical evidence and showed that it worked. Now, the French Revolution, we could say whether it worked or not to varying degrees because it led to the rise of Napoleon. But also, we need to sort of sit back and think because, yes, worldwide revolution could grant these things, but also there's very specific things that market forces could do. Take, for example, the TPP, which was basically enforcing the idea that if you're going to be part of this trade agreement, then any business that is in your country has to at least comply with these basic standards for human decency and the ability for workers to actually be paid on the same amount that's competitive with other workers in other countries that are involved in the same deal. So it's like we could either go for a worldwide bloody revolution that completely collapses, as is this case with every single anarchist society that we've seen. Even the Paris Commune eventually collapsed. And that wasn't actually, I shouldn't even say eventually, because it lasted, months?
Okay, so you could use that justification for feudalism in a certain historical period of time. You could say, feudalism has this consistent track record of perpetuating itself and having this domineering effect on the world until the 5th century in the Dutch. And, prior to that, there were some economic capitalist projects elsewhere in the world. I think that you can use that same sort of empirical justification to perpetuate feudal society. As far as the TPP is concerned, I don't think that's the best analogy because we haven't really seen the effects of it. I believe Trump, scrapped the TPP. I don't know if Biden brought it back. I have to check. So I don't know if that really, I'm not sure I understand why we bring that particular trade agreement up. I don't have a strong opinion on free trade, to be honest. I'm more focused on trying to eliminate the capitalist system and structure of oppression, which is partially facilitated by both free trade agreements and protectionism. You brought up an earlier point. Oh yeah, right. So you said that the bloody revolution and so forth. How about the millions of people who starve annually because of capitalism? How about the sort of fascist governments that are propped up by capital and private sector capitalism? How about the massive wealth, global inequality that produces suffering, homelessness, starving children. We talk about, these deaths that'll come from a bloody revolution, but is it worth it if we have a new permanent state of prosperity and a liberation and so forth? I think it's definitely worth it. This was one of the arguments that were used against the French Revolution. Look at this bloody battle going on with the French Revolution. Look at, the heads being chopped off. Look at this grotesque scene. But Hegel saw in the French Revolution its sort of greatness in its totality, in the sense that we permanently brought forth a new reality, which in the long term, when you look at the long-term trajectory, will lead to less bloody death and destruction. And nobody wants to talk about the suffering produced by the monarchy over an extended period of time. And you said that, there was an antecedent with the French Revolution, with the American Revolution. But the fact of the matter is, many of these, the underpinnings of the French Revolution wasn't people who extensively studied, the American Revolution. These were not people who extensively studied Western Western philosophy and so forth. These were largely, the root of the sans-culotte, or however you pronounce it, the root of the French working class. These were people who felt, repressed. They felt like their voices weren't being heard, and they spontaneously report, Ray Denoviskaya writes a great, passage on this in Marxism and Freedom. Check out chapter 1 of that book. They spontaneously revolted, according to many accounts. There wasn't a philosophical antecedent. They felt exploited, and they undertook, this sort of spontaneous desire for more freedom and liberty. And I think that's just a part of the essence of, existing. And I think that we saw something less comparable in the Hungarian Revolution. There's more of a, ideological pretext, but I think that it to an extent also reaffirms that point. But yeah.
Okay, so first of all, the TPP, the reason why I bring it up is because it's an example of how you could get a more fair environment for workers in all countries involved, especially nations that are typically exploited by capitalist labor. When looking at nations like Taiwan, Singapore, or even places in China, such as Xinjiang, like those are massive places that have way below average pay for workers, even in those areas. So with the TPP, bringing in the notion that you need to have a certain type of human rights and you need to have a certain set of payment, that is one way that you could use the free market to actually increase the ability of living versus trying to recruit everybody into a global worldwide revolution that, like, you use the example of the French Revolution. That's fine and perfect, but it works in one country. Revolutions tend to only work in one country or one specific area. And most of the time, those revolutions either fail or they bring about even worse changes. Look at most of the revolutions that happen in South America or most of the revolutions in Africa. And I know that everybody's going to say, oh, well, it's because American imperialism, but most of those led directly to the rise of fascism. Look at North Korea, led to the rise of fascism. Look at Vietnam, led to the rise of fascism where they're fucking genociding their own indigenous population, and gay marriage is still not legally recognized by that state. So the notion that all revolutions result in some sort of idealistic change, maybe for a very specific class, but that specific class benefits from the rage and untempered willingness to fight against the state. And then once their usefulness is over, they just get tossed away, as opposed to unilateral trade deals that require you, if you want to participate in these things, to at least treat people as human beings.
Yeah, sure. The Trans-Pacific Partnership, like, I know you value empiricism, which is why I think it was interesting that you brought that up as an example of, an ideal. I guess you could, point to preceding trade agreements that, have successfully mitigated human rights abuses and so forth. But the point is, it's still an integration into the exploitative economic mode of production and the systems of oppression. It's merely just a means to facilitate, interaction on a global level to mitigate the harm. It's still not really, negating the destruction and the primary contradictions within the system that make it so insufferable and so problematic. And you say revolution succeed, in a singular, area. I think that there's a bit of a contradiction in your argument there, because you state that the antecedent for the French Revolution was the American Revolution. If that was the case, I think that it would suggest that we can have a sort of global spontaneous influence arising. I don't stand by that position, but I think that there is a bit of a contradiction there if we're to affirm your sort of, standpoint. I think that when you look at the revolutions of 1848, there was a lot of influence. It began in certain regions, but it really did begin to spread throughout Europe. And we saw sort of revolutionary spontaneity that went, beyond just this sort of concrete national level. As far as, North Korea and, Vietnam are concerned, they're really terrible regimes. I don't really know if you can call them fascist, but it's irrelevant because I'm not going to defend them. And so, yeah.
Okay, so the entire idea of bringing up that the American Revolution was a direct influence on the French Revolution was mostly to point out that despite the fact that the American Revolution took place about 10 to 15 years before the French Revolution, we also have to look at the idea that, like you said, in Europe, a lot of people went around and tried to create revolutions on their own. When in reality, let's take a look at the United Kingdom of all examples. The fucking Britbongers are the worst example of this, because I believe it was with the integration of Ireland that they finally became the United Kingdom in general. But the thing is that that's the entire point. Like, the revolution that they went through, or these sort of socio-political changes that they went through, didn't result in any sort of like embetterment. It resulted in a stronger monarchy that had more imperialistic territory. So
Yeah, sure.
not all of these things were like amazingly good revolutions for the people. A lot of these actually ended up being horrible for them. I don't think anybody actually looks at Maximilian Robespierre and says like, "Oh, that was an amazing dude." Unless if you read,
I think
like, you know,
Maximilian Robespierre was a good guy, to be completely honest. I think that he did to a large extent what was necessary. I wouldn't say he's a good guy. I'd say that, to an extent, when I look at it from a dialectical materialist perspective, I can see the position he was in and to an extent understand his actions. I don't think he's a good guy. As far as your comments about revolutions oftentimes producing negative, results or externalities, I think that's a complete non sequitur, because I don't think that revolutions are intrinsically axiomatically going to produce good positive results. I'm simply saying that we can have a positive revolutionary movement that affirms liberty and freedom and tries to fight back against repressive, tyrannical systems of oppression. And I feel like you're sort of moving away from your assertion that, a revolution is a concrete, regional phenomenon, and that is a historically identifiable reality. Even if it's true that many of these sort of, spontaneous revolutions throughout Europe, had that characteristic of, not, being successful or not producing the end result, it does show that, you got this sort of spontaneous development beyond a particular region, and so you can, influence global geopolitics, and you can have an influence that's beyond just your specific concrete region. I think that's what that demonstrates on a fundamental level, and yeah, that would be my response.
Okay, my response would be that it is absolutely fucking insane to look at all prior revolutions that have resulted in fascism and say, well, we can take a look at that and just expand it globally, and maybe this time it'll work out. Like, this is the logic that somebody uses when they're in their dorm room smoking weed. You need empiricism because you need that basis to set up a precedent of what has happened before. So we can see that, yes, everybody who revolts against systemic abuses are good, but when we look at the result of most of the people that revolted against systemic abuses by the state, they ended up creating states that were more abusive in the long term. The Russian Revolution, before the Soviets got involved, was strictly against the idea that the Tsar had ultimate power and that the Duma was essentially a showcase. What happened after that? Fucking the Holodomor. We could look at North Korea and say, okay, all of these people were wanting freedom and wanting equality, and they just wanted generalized good conditions for farming. And what happened there? They have a god king. So it's
Can I interject really quick? Because
yeah.
I don't like the premise of your argument, because you say we can look at these fascist, reactionary revolutions that occurred in these countries. I just don't think that, in its totality negates the necessity for a revolution. I can point to plenty of positive examples of revolutionary efforts, whether it be, successful ones or temporarily successful ones. The Paris Commune was temporarily a beacon of hope for the proletariat, ultimately collapsed. Or, a more permanent one, the French Revolution was overall a net positive, even if we could argue that it perpetuated certain problematic hierarchies that led to the rise of Napoleon Bonaparte and so forth. I think that fundamentally, hold on, I need to give me a second to think. Okay, I remember now. So I think that the argument, God, I forgot what you said. Okay, could you repeat your argument, because I totally forgot.
I'm trying to think of what my previous argument was, but honestly, like right now, I'm just hitting a bunch of CBD and.
All right. I guess you can.
If we're at a bit of an impasse or we've forgotten a train of thought, I think that there's maybe some interesting aspects we can go down, because I think we're kind of circling around some similar points anyway. So one thing I really wanted to get into is the concept of.
I think I remember now.
Okay,
yeah.
go on.
Okay, so North Korea and, the Soviet Union, they certainly did, produce negative results overall. But I'd argue that, for example, take the Soviet Union. I wouldn't necessarily blame, the Russian Revolution of 1917 for, the rise of Stalin and, the genocide of the Holodomor. I'd say it's quite the contrary. I'd say that's an example of a counter-revolution, the bourgeoisie, essentially taking command. Because when you look at Lenin himself, he was a very pro-trade unionist. He believed in the affirmation of the Soviets. And I don't, necessarily like Lenin as an anarchist. I'm just saying that I don't see the sort of pretext for Stalin in Lenin, because Stalin essentially destroyed any capacity for worker control. I'd argue that is a counter revolution. And you said that, before the Soviet revolution, you said that before the Bolsheviks took power, there was a positive revolution that was simply about the negation of the Tsars. I think that's improper framing, because without that, Bolshevik control, I don't think that it would sustain itself, because the factory committees, which were, the backbone of the revolt in that region, they did not have a cohesive consciousness. They did not have a cohesive class consciousness. They didn't really, develop with a coherent unit. They were very stratified. And that's why I don't think it would sustain itself. I think that the Bolsheviks taking power, this is not a very popular thing from an anarchist to say, because a lot of anarchists have this very distorted perception of what Lenin did. I don't like Lenin, but I do think that, the Bolsheviks taking control is not this sort of antagonistic precursor to Stalin that many people think it was. Stalin got rid of Trotsky, who, in my opinion, further developed, was more Leninist in his character than Stalin was. Stalin totally perverted Lenin in terms of commodity production, the nature of socialism, the nature of trade unions, revolts, so forth. So I just don't agree with that premise logically. I think that also you need to empirically justify your position that, generally speaking, revolutions produce negative results, because you keep strawmanning by saying I don't care about empiricism. I do care about empiricism, but I think it has its limitations. I see empirical analysis as merely just another tool in our methodologies and in our ability to interpret the world and try to understand it further. I need, for example, I do need an empirical proof that revolution is a net negative and that it'll generally lead to fascism. Yeah, Benito Mussolini in Italy was terrible. These various fascist revolts were terrible, and there were still many successful revolutions and attempts to change society. We wouldn't be where we are today in many regards without the sort of revolutionary backbone of society. Even the reforms we have are largely a byproduct of the sort of reformist, the revolutionary undertones that led to reforms in the first place.
Well, there were certainly revolutionary undertones to things that we take for granted today. The fact of the matter is that things like unionization within the United States, while being helped out by the IWW to a great extent, most of this was just a common basis for America calling for change in the workplace. And if we're going to talk about how Lenin was something to aspire to, Lenin believed that capitalism was the only way to actually get Russia of the state that he and his government put in. Forgetting that Lenin started the NEP, which
you're cutting off a little, or is that just me?
No, there's some roboting going on. Yeah, it's not your mic, it's the connection.
Oh,
okay.
sorry.
I think it's back to normal.
Right.
Oh, maybe not.
Oh God. This is
Okay.
what you get for having.
There we go. I think you're back.
Okay. So basically, Lenin himself saw the need for there to be a transitionary process, especially involving capitalism, because he saw the absolute devastation that him and his comrades wrecked. That's why he created the NEP, which legalized private property and ownership of businesses. Now, also to address the point that Stalin perverted his ideas, yes, he obviously did. But the other thing is that Trotsky is no fucking angel. Trotsky would have been an absolute horrible monster to replace Lenin, because he would have he advocated for actual war against all of Europe. So, do you honestly believe that in any sort of sense that the influence that Lenin had would have been greater than, say, a capitalist grown economy within the USSR? Because I would want to see data on that, because yes, it's obviously true. The Russian Revolution of 1905 was not about Bolshevism. It was about the idea that they were recently freed as serfs, and they were sick of being still pushed around by the Tsar as if they were serfs. That's the entire reason why the courtroom Duma was set up.
Yeah, sure. So starting from the back argument, I agree with you that, Trotsky would have been a disaster as well. He was no angel. Although I'd argue when you look at his later writings, it's certainly not comparable to Stalin in any respect. Yeah, he was, this sort of ridiculous, pragmatist. He thought he was a pragmatist, but in reality, he was just repressing worker control and so forth. But I don't think it's fair to suggest it's comparable to Stalin. And even with Trotsky, there is still a delineation from Lenin. The theory of permanent revolution is still a delineation from Lenin. So I'd still argue that you're not really seeing a foundational core antecedent from Lenin to Trotsky and Stalin, as some would argue. As far as the new economic policy is concerned, yeah, Lenin did believe in, a temporary capitalist transition to socialism given the semi-feudal nature of the Soviet economy. I argue that's a non sequitur because I explicitly point out that I don't agree with every aspect and every facet of Lenin. But the reason why I still think that it was a net positive to have that Bolshevik revolt was because of the incoherent nature of the workers' movement at that time, which, we saw the supersession of that with the Bolsheviks taking control. If it was the Mensheviks, if it was others, it would be significantly worse, in my opinion. And as far as your preceding point about how, the trade unionist movement, it's largely, you said that the revolutionary efforts played a significant role, but at the same time, it was, primarily a non-revolutionary reformist undercurrent that, produced these reforms. I think that's just an incorrect statement. I think that a large extent of FDR's significant reforms. I think that when you look at the historical catalog and how, the labor movement tried to pressure FDR, it is revolutionary undercurrents producing substantial, fundamental, systemic, reforms. I think that, Social Security, I think, many of these programs, they were largely because of a means in which we can, satisfy the demands of the common people because there was these competing ideologies and competing apparatuses, and I think that is an example of revolutionary influences. And just a fun fact, we as leftists valued the autonomy of women or trans men or non-binary people to get abortions. Well, without Emma Goldman, and the anarchists, they played a large role in securing birth control, and they played a large role in through their revolutionary efforts, through some violent means even, they did play a significant role in the women's rights movement and, securing, birth control rights and so forth. So there's large revolutionary antecedents to a significant amount of the positive reforms that we've seen. Yeah.
Okay, I feel like we've spoken a lot about the USSR, and I kind of want to move a bit past that. So, I want to look to more modern problems require modern solutions. And there's one thing in particular that I personally am really interested to hear you two discuss, and that is the concept of and excuse the terminology, but police, law and order, justice, or whatever fucking new anarchist term there is for it. But I'm really interested here. So obviously we've got a system which you probably both agree at the moment is flawed in many ways, and in some cases broken. So I'm kind of just interested to hear your perspectives on what you think you would do within your kind of system that you're advocating for. So as yours is probably more radical, Zoomination, if I throw it over to you first, and then we'll let Moirai respond, okay?
Yeah, sure. So we've seen with the defund the police, we've seen a certain empirical examples such as New Jersey where that's produced net positive results. We see that once you allocate monetary funds to other areas, so you have a more multifaceted policing system, you lead to less of an incarceration state, you produce less aggregate crime. I don't think that we disagree there. So on that point, I think that there's going to be some agreement that we need to allocate funds, but I'd argue we need to go even further than what we saw in New Jersey and in certain other particular examples. I'd argue that we do need to abolish the police as an extension of the state, which is the primary producer of violence, which has a monopoly on violence, which is antithetical to the interest of trans people, antithetical to the interest of the working class, antithetical to marginalized groups in general. We want to liberate ourselves from these systems of oppression, and that includes abolishing the police. The primary thieves, or at least one of the primary groups that are engaged in stealing, they're not even held accountable. Look at the civil asset forfeiture, the significant, substantial amount of money that the cops accrue from civil asset forfeiture. Look at the indiscriminate violence that they engage in, which has led to such a lack of cohesive society, which has led to a lot of protests and so forth. We need a complete abolition. And you could argue what will replace that. And this is where I'm going to get a lot of hate from anarchists, or at least certain online anarchists, who might call themselves Sternerites, or, radical, anarchists. But I don't think that it's antagonistic towards anarchism to have, a sort of community where, people switch around the roles of examining what's happening to prevent crime. I don't think that voluntarily choosing to have a model or system where, people take turns, to secure the area, I don't think that's an anathema to any foundational anarchist principles. I think that is totally common sense. But I'd point out that a significant amount of the crime that is produced in contemporary times is a product of, the unjustified hierarchies. And I mean hierarchies in general that we as anarchists revolt against. I think the hierarchies of capitalism, I think that produces a lot of, the alienation that might lead to drug addictions. It might produce a lot of robberies and thefts because people are economically insecure. We see, murder and homicide largely because a social fabric is non-existent because of the lack of a, solidarity-based foundational, mechanism of society. I think that a lot of the, crime and destruction and so forth is a product of liberal values. Bastiat, John Stuart Mills, all of that might sound great in theory, but the practice is a pure unmitigated disaster is all I can say.
Okay, so in response to bringing up Bastiat, I think Bastiat had a good point, and that is that you cannot have a justice system without having an unjust society, or you cannot have injustice in a society and go without a justice system. Now, when we talk about police reform and police abolition, we hear people throw around this bullshit, horrible fucking slogan, ACAB, and then you have to go through a dialogue tree that's about 1,000 miles long of them explaining how it's either implementing community policing or implementing reformist changes to the police. Now, obviously, I don't believe that the police are good at all. They, by definition, are actors of the state. They serve the purpose of enforcing specific laws, some of which are unjust, some of which are perfectly okay. But the thing is that when it comes to policing, we need to actively think about, like, if we're talking about complete replacement of the police, we need to think about what we're going to replace it with. There's a lot of things that people point to on the internet, and they say, oh, look at what happened with Chaz. They did community policing. We gave everybody guns. They shot fucking teenagers. Nobody's ever fucking been caught for that. Nobody's ever been fucking cornered for that. And everybody on the internet who is supporting of it just fucking went away. And then you have dipshits like Trekkie69 who suddenly believes that the minute that you have anarchism, all crime suddenly stops existing, ignoring the idea that humanity on its own still has an innate desire to acquire a lot of resources, even if that means theft. So there's bullshit anarchists on the internet that will tell you that crime will never exist under anarchism, and that's complete bullshit. And I don't care what, like, online LARPers like fucking Trekkie says about that bullshit, because it's fucking annoying. But I want to know what anarchists believe when it comes to reforming the police or getting rid of the police, because, like, we could either go with, like, the, like, Paul Town idea of we're just going to have death squads, or we have the idea that we're going to replace them with entirely emotional support. And there's arguments that we can have a strong balance between people who enforce civil laws and then people who respond to mental health crises.
Okay, so let's start with the Bastiat quote. So I think that's another example of a non sequitur, in the sense that I think it's a general, a very popular philosophical notion that, there's a duality between things, that without good, there's, no evil. Without evil, there's no good. That applies, of course, to justice and injustice. I don't think that really refutes the point that, we can mitigate, destruction and chaos and suffering and crime in a society that's differently organized from the way society is currently organized. I don't know what you mean by humanity has an innate predilection towards crime, in the sense that, nature is not a monolith. You can use nature as an a priori justification for virtually anything, because nature is not this monolithic entity, which is why it's so annoying when conservatives appeal to it so much. Yeah, it's natural to murder people. It's natural to help people. It's natural to rape people. It's natural to not rape people. These are all, natural predilections. We need to organize a community and a society that enables us to thrive, because that's what we desire. We desire to thrive and prosper. I don't know why that appeal to nature is, necessary. As far as Chaz is concerned, okay, Chaz, there's literally there. I literally saw this. There's a lot of people in Chaz that are various ideological predilections. There's somebody with a DDR flag in their background. They're still private property. It's still just teenagers trying to be edgy and cool and rad and hip. And I've got a lot of I don't know if you're like implying that about me when I defended Chaz, but that's not my best moment. But the point still stands that Chaz is not really the best example of a anarchist system operating properly, because I think that my argument is just based on common sense. I think it's common sense that when you don't have alienating hierarchies, you're not going to produce as much crime and drugs and suffering in society. When you have a more localized system, they can be held more accountable, and we're going to have less examples of injustice. My problem with this sort of empirical, emphasis is that you're literally trying to, undermine our natural ability to make rational conclusions by saying that because things are the way they are, because we've perpetually lived in the conditions that we do, and because they produce said results, then therefore we must perpetuate that. That is fundamentally the thesis of a purely empirical worldview and philosophy. And I just don't affirm that. I just think that on a common sense level, look at what produces crime. Let's mitigate that. Let's deal with those hierarchies that are alienating in their nature. Let's try to, like I said, I believe in a system of, organizing to mitigate crime and so forth. Let's organize that. Let's build that framework so that we can prevent crime. That's important. That's great. As far as, you said that, all cops are bastards, a convoluted and problematic statement. Here's the thing. I think that it's really annoying when I hear liberals say, all cops are bastards is such a terrible statement because, you're trying to rationalize something abstract. Like, hey, this cop is good. This cop is good. It's simple, okay? We're not looking at this on an individualistic level. We're looking at this on a structural, systemic level, okay? Certain systems, certain, positions in society produce certain outcomes and results. To me, the most shocking thing about all that instances of police brutality you see is not the individual engaging in the police brutality. It's the people standing by and doing nothing as it happens, because that's what the structure and that's what the system, that's the behavior that it reproduces. That is what all cops are bastards is about. You can talk about how great of a guy Chad is, but when Chad is standing by while, a cop is harassing you and brutalizing you, you'll understand that he's a different kind of problematic that you didn't foresee at first. That is a systemic critique that ACAB is predicated upon. It is not about individual, social analysis. That's just not the point of ACAB.
Okay, but it then brings up the idea that, okay, we all know that cops exist to enforce laws created by the state. Whether or not I agree with the laws of the state or not, or whether or not I agree that the cops are good or not.
Oh, I think you've frozen again. more internet issues, unfortunately. Let me try and.
Am I back?
Yeah, you're back.
Okay, I'm back. Cool. Okay, so when it comes to ACAB, the thing is that when you're trying to recruit people to your cause, the one thing that you don't want to do is actively alienate them. The fact of the matter is that most people have a common, most people have an actual good response to the police. Most people in the world will say cops are fucking bastards and horrible, but the minute their house gets broken into, they're going to call the cops and they're going to actively give them every single piece of information in the entire world. This is like Mel on Twitter saying, fucking gangs do better for the inner city, and then getting the reply of, hey, N-word, that's the true thing, and then her being like, well, gee golly, folks, thanks, I'm from the streets. Like, the main question that I have is that if you want to replace our police or repeal police or reform the police, what active idea do you have for doing this? Like,
okay,
you can't
so
just say we're going to get rid of them.
Yeah, sure. So as far as that point is concerned, you might hate the cops, but you're going to call them, it's such an asinine argument, because you could say you claim you hate capitalism and yet you purchase, capitalist clothes. Yes, we're operating with a particular system. I don't want to be murdered. I don't want to be raped. so on and so forth. Yeah, I'm going to call someone and give them information because that's just how the structure is set up. I don't think I think it's an anathema to rational analysis to make that kind of framework of argumentation. As far as the point Mel made about, how mobs are, more reliable, I think that there's an essence of truth to her statement in the sense that, in a mob dominated area, you might, instead of the cops, you might just rely upon them. That isn't an inherent ethical justification for the mob. It's just the way society is structured. So, like, in that sense, I get her point, although it's probably worded in a poor sort of fashion. As far as, what is your alternative? I gave a alternative. You could argue that it's vague. Yeah, I don't have like 50 experts with me, analyzing every component. How are we going to protect the waterways? How are we going to protect this? I'm giving a vague framework for which we can operate under. Some, principles we can operate under in which we, manage our communities and manage our societies. I think that I think that looking for something more concrete is problematic in the sense that, in philosophy, they discuss this. A lot of totalitarian regimes, they rise by, focusing on the particularities, and they emphasize that to such a significant degree, to a dogmatic degree. We saw this with Stalin in a lot of his writings, that they have this sort of exact concrete way things need to be in order to proceed with the dialectic. And what that produces is an undermining of liberty. What that produces is the lack of a flexibility to come up with positive outcomes and positive solutions. I think that's what you're really missing with your analysis there by trying to focus so much on the concrete. I think America is foundationally built on abstract principles, and then people subsequently build upon that their ideas and innovations. And that's not to endorse America. That's just making a vague gesture to what I'm trying to talk about here. But yeah.
Okay, so unironically, are you appealing to the idea that socialism is when the government does stuff? I don't know.
What?
Or maybe I heard that argument completely wrong. Just because you were talking about controlling the waterways and things like that, which are not something that the police do.
No, I mean protecting the waterways. Like let's say, like, I got that analogy because I was watching a movie the other day. But like when there's crime going on in the waterway, who will observe that? Like, I'm just bringing up like pragmatic concerns. It's a substitute for the argument that we need to look at the pragmatic concerns and everything.
Yeah, because I was gonna say that would mostly be like coast guards and stuff. So that would be an argument for
Right.
integrate. That would be like
Mhm.
super fascist arguments for like integrating the police and the military, like China does, which is something that I don't want to happen.
Right, of course.
Yeah. I would say that in an ideal society, we should bust up police unions. I'm firmly against police unions because they have an unbelievable amount of control over the city. Police unions could essentially hold mayors ransom. Look what happened in Cleveland, Ohio, where the police chief essentially went out and said that they were going to arrest every single journalist that was on the street during the George Floyd protests, and the mayor could absolutely do nothing about it aside from go, "Oh well, geez, guys, I'm really sorry about this." And it got to the point where they had to do an actual federal probe into this. So we obviously need to reform a lot of the police. We need to start by taking down police unions and taking away their bargaining power. We need to stop giving the ability to constantly go on TV and say, well, this person was no angel when we shot them. But the entire idea that we can just start from scratch with this new proposed idea of, social policing is like, I don't know.
From scratch. The basis is, basic understandings of a particular aspect of human beings and trying to structurally orient ourselves towards that nature. I think I reject the premise that there aren't, natural foundations to what I'm advocating for. And I just brought up the waterway thing as a substitute about how we shouldn't really emphasize every little pragmatic concern when we're having an abstract debate, because we're just talking about the foundations of what we'd ideally like to see. That's all that point was. And I agree with you about abolishing police unions. Of course, we need to do all those things, but I don't think that would be sufficient. I still think that we have an extension of a repressive state apparatus. I think that if we took liberal Enlightenment values to their rational conclusion, it would also entail the negation of the state, because you're still not fully free to develop yourself and to have a community that is bonded together on non-coercive means. So that's just what I'm saying there. Yeah.
I mean, like, obviously this is like kind of a hard debate for me because that I like you so much, Zoomer, but then there's so much that we disagree on. So I don't know. I think that people are going to try. I think that we both agree on the fact that we need to abolish police unions. The problem is that people, especially lefties, especially like super white lefties, like fucking reflect the sunlight back. They're going to say this is like slippery slope arguments to get us to abolish all unions. When people don't understand the idea that police unions are fundamentally different than labor unions. They don't do anything aside from keep police who murder people actively out of criminal trials. They're fucking horrible and they need to stop. And I don't know. I agree. I'm glad that you agree on the fact that we need to abolish police unions, because there are certain unions that should exist, like labor unions, and then there's certain unions that shouldn't exist, like fucking police unions. There's probably 1,000 white people out there saying, "Holy shit, why are you trying to get rid of police unions?" And then they're probably going to be like, "Why are these two white people arguing on the internet?" And it's like, I'm fucking Asian, and you're also Central Asian, as far as I remember. So it's like, I don't know.
So, to address two previous points, so I'm glad we were able to reconcile our position on those issues. But to address two previous points that I missed or moved over, you said that what would happen to those social safety nets that many people rely upon early in the debate? You said, the people are going to kick grandmas off of Medicare. Are you going to kick people off of this? This has always been this is like the Pete Buttigieg argument against Medicare for all. Are you going to replace people's private health insurance that they already have with Medicare for all? Yeah, we absolutely are, because it's a better system and because the previous system perpetuates systems of exploitation. I'd say, yeah, grandma, get off your Medicare, because we have this mutual aid system that is far more preferable and doesn't perpetuate, state monopoly and exploitation and so forth. As you also said, a lot of people are going to hear the slogan ACAB, all cops are bastards, and that's going to turn people away from the movement, or abolish the police, and that's going to turn people away from the movement. Every anarchist theorist has noticed this, from Emma Goldman to Enrico Malatesta. There's always going to be a strata of the masses that are more intelligent, not more intelligent, but more, conscious than the others, that have a more developed, and, acute theoretical foundation than others. And they're going to push for that. That doesn't mean that, the entire masses is going to submit to that, but it is moving the Overton window to the left. It is shifting discourse, because look at what happened, when they were talking about, now the conservative argument is defund the police. That's ridiculous. We need police reform. Tim Scott, he alluded to that a little bit in his, response to Biden's State of the Union, not State of the Union, the joint Congress, whatever. His response to that was, like, you see this sort of undercurrent of the discourse shifting left because of these radical extremist positions taken. I think that that's sort of an effect it has, but there's obviously going to be a radical strata of people that are more radicalized than others. But yeah.
Okay, so I would argue that you both need to defund the police significantly to a fraction of what they have, and you also need to reform them. Because right now we do have several states where there are responders that are specifically trained in mental health. The problem is that I believe it was the Philadelphia Police Department that has an entire mental health response unit that is nothing but people who are trained therapists, and they still show up like they're dressed for a fucking game of Call of Duty. Like, I'm waiting for these people to jump out of the bushes to grab people who are having horrible days and about to commit suicide in fucking ghillie suits. So the thing is that we definitely do need reform and we need defunding. But I would say that before we start saying like ACAB and everything else, the entire point of trying to draw people to your movement, which is this is why the right wing wins so much, is the idea that they have messaging that signals to their people specifically, but also on the face of it will make the normal person go, "Oh, I could get behind that." So when you go out guns blazing and say like all cops are bastards or like eat the rich or some shit like that, you're not going to draw more people in. You're going to make more people feel alienated, and that's just the case of it.
Yeah,
If that
sure.
makes sense.
Sure. I'd like to see some sort of, empirical, like, I don't know if there's like an empirical correlation in Philadelphia, for example, with an increase in crime and what you mentioned as a phenomena, people unprepared. Like, I definitely want to see whether or not, it adds up or, so forth. But I agree with you, Bakunin supported worker militias, for example. I'm fine with people, trading off roles within a community voluntarily in order to organize and prevent, crime from occurring. I don't think that's an anathema to anarchist principles, and I think anarchists who reject that are being idealistic. And as far as right-wing messaging is concerned, I think one of the reasons why right-wing messaging is so successful is because they're willing to signal to their base so much. They're willing to, serve their base and what they desire and want. I think that the neoliberal democratic establishment fails to do so. I think that is definitely a role. Although I know that, there's disagreements on that particular point. I think that as far as, ACAP being alienating, it can be alienating. I think that, I believe, of course, in revolution, not reformism. I don't want to reconcile, with state power because I think it'll inevitably still produce negative results. I think that even under neoliberal governments, we saw a massive amount of oppression and repression. I think that we can signal boost the message of ACAB to the people that are working outside of a parliamentary or a sort of democratic structure, people that are trying to shatter that system. I think we need to build towards that. And, these people can be pushing for reforms against the government, great movements in India trying to push the fascist Modi government, to do what it wants while also having a sort of revolutionary undercurrent. I definitely like that particular dynamic in play. But yeah, of course, I think that failure to serve the base is a foundational reason why the Democratic Party fails. But yeah.
Yeah, I would say I mostly agree with you on that. The only concern that I would have when it comes to community policing, things like that, are we're assuming that the community itself isn't going to be, like, for example, racist. Like, it's like when Peter Coffin had the debate with Destiny and came up with, well, if we have every single union and if we have every single business having a union, then there's going to be less racism within that business. When it's not a matter of how much power you give the individual worker, it's a matter of how much the group votes for. So you could have all of the freedom in the world that you want, but so long as a community is still super fucking racist, they're still going to do super fucking racist things. They're just going to have a better, stronger example of why the racism is validated. And we already have that with the police already. So, like, I I would wonder how much it would happen with say, like, Wicker Park, Chicago versus, like, Gary, Indiana. Like, if we have the Wicker Park community police that are mostly out there policing, like, fucking art crimes, go into Gary and Indiana, and then obviously we'd see a massive amount of community shootings or some, like, real guardian angel shit on buses, or even like a Bernie Getz style moment. And we
Yeah.
also have to
So
remember too that real quick, I just wanted to address too, because, like, we also have to remember the reason why, like, a lot of people, especially during Trump's second campaign, were kind of on board with him when he was signaling for law and order. It's not because he was actually signaling for the idea that we need to enforce laws equally and we need to make sure that there's order in the way that we do it. It was that he was signaling the idea of we need to make sure that we are being as racist as we fucking possibly can. But the thing is that there's an inherent truth to the fact that we need more law and order, because I believe that the latest statistics were that, like, from 2020 alone, like, crime jumps like, dramatically from, I believe, 2018. So again, like, that's what I talk about when it comes to messaging, because you have the right wingers are so amazing when it comes to these messages where it's, oh, hey, we need law and order, and to us, we know that it means, oh, they want people to be able to go out there and just shoot black people with reckless abandon. But to the average person, or like your average CNN wine mom, that just means, oh yeah, I could get behind that. That means, we need to, like, start enforcing the person who went to go and, like, key my car. Like, I'm obviously on board with that. So I don't know, but I do agree with you.
yeah, so as far as, the pragmatic concern is concerned, like, in these unionized places or, in these decentralized communities, what if there's racism that manifests, and what if there's, repression that manifests? I think that there's this very commonly perpetuated myth that, there's this working class populist right wing that, is, pro union but hates gay people, that's pro, this but hates that. you know the gay marriage or public. I think that some people analyze this, that there's this populist conservatives we need to get. I just think that it's a fabricated myth. I think that foundationally this goes into Gramsci's analysis of cultural hegemony. We need an intersectional revolt against power structures and systems of oppression. I don't agree with Peter Coffin, just expand unions, give people workers power and there won't be racism. No, we need a like what we saw, the counterculture of the 60s, except even more coherent and more powerful. We need a revolt against every facet of repression and oppression. We need a fight against the superstructure that exists. And only then, when we have an intersectionally based revolt against these systems of repression, can we produce the outcomes we want, where there isn't a society where you have a community of, racist, you have a racist community where, they want to lynch black people and so forth. But I'd argue that the more, if it's more decentralized to such a radical level, it's easier to, revolt against those racial structures because they're more decentralized and because they're organized in such a way. But I think it isn't even that pertinent of a point of analysis, because I don't think that we can have revolt without an intersectional backbone. I don't think there can be a decentralized racist community, because those values are an anathema to one another. Social conservatives that claim they're leftist on economics, what does that mean? Okay, they want corporatism. They want like phalangism. That's still a workerist ideology. That's still an ideology that maintains many of the foundational essences of capitalism. So, yeah.
Okay, so generally, I would say that the entire, like, when it comes to corporatism and things like that, obviously I'm against that. However, I do fundamentally believe that there is a strong argument to be made for the market being a predictor of how things go, and for the market fundamentally needing a right to exist, at least even to transition to a better state. Because every single argument that I've heard against the market just seems to be this idea of, we're just going to replace the market with something that is the market, but we're going to call it something else. Because it seems like a lot of anarchist theory that I've read seems to have this idea of like definitionalism. Like, if we change the definition, then suddenly it just becomes better. So it's like, you'll have, I'm trying to like think of like a good example that comes to mind that's not like some pop anarchist, because you'll have, people argue, okay, well, sure, we don't need prisons, we don't need private prisons. And it's like, yes, I agree, we don't need private prisons. But then you'll have somebody go on the complete opposite direction and say, what we need is voluntary anarchist labor camps where people can rehabilitate themselves. And then it's like, okay, you've just went from like one extreme to the far fucking other on that. And I think that fundamentally, the idea that capitalism is so ingrained within our society that even anarchists today cannot actually fundamentally formulate ideas that don't rely on like the specter of capitalism, or throwing themselves into something that is essentially just capitalism rebranded. It's almost like it's almost like capitalist realism is an actual thing.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that there is a problem of capitalist realism amongst anarchists, amongst Marxist-Leninists who emphasize the GDP of the Soviet Union. But I think that is, once again, I feel like I don't want to associate myself with that form, because it's like been ostracized by so many people as not genuinely meeting these anarchist principles. So like, I don't really feel the need to justify or defend people that are talking about anarcho camps that are really, integrated into a capitalist realist mindset and the institutions that, perpetuate capitalism. However, I will say that there's just fundamental errors with markets that are irreconcilable. I think that the tragedy of the commons is a primordial example of that, in the sense that when you have these competing actors within a market economy and you don't have a mechanism to reconcile with different market interests and valuations and price signals, you're going to have the lack of certain goods that are need to be produced. You're going to have overproduction crises. You're not going to be able to properly manage resources oftentimes because of the sort of incoherent nature of that system. This is a critique of Mises that was brought out by certain socialists. I'd say that there's other issues with markets, like I expounded upon prior. Markets tend to incentivize a lack of innovation because we already have these concrete examples of products that have successfully been sold, and therefore we need to continue to perpetuate that framework and that reference. And a lot of these chuds who complain about these SJW movies, they talk about the repetitive nature of these movies. That's largely a product of the sort of supply line of Marvel movies that are being produced, and I think that's emblematic of the general market trends. You see this sort of curtailing of innovation, and there's just inexorable laws of capitalism that I think that the markets of markets in general that will lead to its decline and collapse, like the falling rate of profit, like the crisis of overproduction, as it exacerbates, as wages are, stagnant and yet production increases on a substantial level, that leads to a crisis in, the production. I don't believe that the fall of capitalism and the rise of socialism is inevitable, but I think that a sort of crisis in a market economy is an inevitable part, because I subscribe to Marx's critique of political economy. But I think there's a lot of issues with markets that are irreconcilable. And I think that how we want to replace markets, I think that's an interesting conversation. I'm not somebody who like I said, I'm open to ideas, but I think that on a basic level, I want production to be oriented on use value, produce what people desire. And, we have the means in order to, calibrate people's desires. I think that oftentimes your desires are not met in a market economy because they're so conditioned by, advertising and the production process, because they don't want to take risks. People oftentimes have, value signifiers too, which, on a human, level, you might not desire this Lamborghini. You might not desire a lot of the excesses of production of luxuries that go on. But because of this alienating market structure, because of this desire for price signals and status chasing, which is a product of class society, you end up emphasizing these luxuries in replacement with genuine wants. And I think that's the sort of artificiality of the market mechanism. So I think that there's a lot of genuine issues in market economies that can't be reconciled with. And I think it requires just a new way of producing on a fundamental level.
Okay, first of all, I'm glad that we could agree that we both don't believe that Brie Larson's trying to destroy the Earth with a laser from outer space. That's a
Good step so far.
The second thing that I was going to say is that I don't fundamentally see an issue with there being luxury items, because I myself love having a Gucci bag. I've not paid full price for it because I borrowed it from a shopping cart. But still, there's fundamentally nothing wrong with there being luxury good items. I mean, everybody has a luxury good item of some kind. Like, even you have.
Can I ask you a question?
Yeah.
Do you think that people have natural wants? Like, do you think people have some natural desires?
Yes, I believe that people have natural desires for food or for water or things like that. Obviously, people also have natural.
No, I think that
Oh, I was gonna say people also have
So-
like natural predications as to like how they wish to dress or things like that. Like, even as a child, you sort of, without an understanding of the way the world works, you still have like an actual like innate desire to be like, oh, I want that cool action figure.
Sure. So when you have like a stratified class society where, there's this external forces beyond just your want, like you want to appease certain people, you want to, be perceived in a certain way. Don't you think that a commodified spectacle society might, reorient your wants away from what might have occurred in a society where you produced exclusively based on use value? And, don't you think it conditions what you want, and perhaps it leads to an excess waste of resources that could have been, used in a different way?
I feel okay. I feel that any system that relies on the distribution of resources, be it an anarchist society, be it a communist society, be it a socialist society, is always going to fall to the overproduction or underproduction. Because you could look at you could look at the Soviet Union and see massive underproductions, despite the fact that they had a system called Agos, which was a essentially primitive AI to determine what grain output should be, and yet fundamentally failed on that. So, like, the idea that just by having an anarchist society, you're going to get rid of like the fact that you're going to have surplus goods seems to be relying on the idea that you're going to have like an absolute way of making sure that you're going to have exactly what you need, unless if you have an exact scientific calculation as to what everybody in the earth needs at that specific moment. You're always going to have like a fundamental either surplus or a fundamental negative. Like, that's just the nature of having goods or services or food.
Right. So I think that the crisis of overproduction is like a law of capitalism, because production for production's sake is such a foundational aspect of capitalism, and perpetual growth in production is necessary to keep the system flowing and going. So I think that there's an extra added, vulnerability to overproduction. And you mentioned the USSR. The USSR operated with the law of value. It was foundationally still a capitalist economy. If we're going to apply Marx's, critique of political economy, if we're going to go based on that foundation, I think that even when you saw less in American history, I think that you saw the boom bust cycle substantially mitigated when the market forces were more under the control of the government. I think that's just a general undeniable trend you've seen, even with the USSR, because it was less pushed by abstract market-oriented forces. There was a sort of the lessening of the rate of crises that occurred, and you saw when Khrushchev in the 60s brought back a more substantial subsidy, or he got rid of the subsidy system and he brought back significant market reforms. I think that the economy actually became more vulnerable to the whims of a capitalist market economy, although the USSR was always capitalist. But I think that you might be right that there will be a crisis in too much production in a non-market economy. I don't think it would have the same external consequences. I don't think that it would be to the same extent, and I don't think that it has the same prerequisites like the system of wage labor, like the system of profits that it really exacerbates the character of that crisis. So that's my response to that.
Okay, well, I would say that basically when it comes down to it, let's take, for example, farming. You're always going to, no matter what the society is and no matter what the actual framework that you're operating under, you're going to always have either under or overproduction of goods. Now, you can say that it's wasteful to have overproduction of goods and that we should actively redistribute them, which is a good thing to do. Like, we should have a profitable way for people to get goods that are get their over surplus out and still make a little bit of a profit on that. But the thing is that we already do kind of have that in terms of corn subsidies. So, my dress is falling off. But still, like, I don't want to flash anybody on your stream, Chad. I'm sorry.
It's all good.
Um,
I'm sure it'll be fine.
I mean,
yeah. So I guess I just guess that I'm gonna have to agree to disagree, not in the sense that I'm conceding the point, but in the sense that I think that it's to me so clear that overproduction becomes a real tangible crises when there's the capitalist mode of production, because of its emphasis on production in order to accrue a profit. Whereas, like, think of it in this hypothetical sense, okay? When you have like 50 competing firms, trying to accrue a profit and competing over resource allocation and so forth, I think that you're obviously going to have a greater chance of a crisis of overproduction than in a system where you just have a community of resources and you allocate those resources based on use value. Because when there is an exchange value in hand, demand is going to oftentimes substantially supply is going to substantially cross the demand, and it's going to lead to exacerbation of a artificially based economy, an economy that isn't based around just human interactions and social interactions. I think that'll just formulate a more massive crisis in totality. Like, that's the way I see it.
Okay. Yeah, I would agree to disagree with you on that. I don't want to go all blood sports on it. I believe so far that we've avoided blood sports. Like, I've not just been like, oh, fucking idiots. Which it's always nice to have nuanced debates about topics like this where we obviously disagree.
Okay, so I mean, we've got like 25 minutes left to chat about whatever. Were there any topics anyone wanted in particular to discuss or get into, or any other disagreements wanted to?
I'm not sure.
I would say one thing that I wanted to address is the fact that we always use liberal as like some sort of dunk, or we always see people go around and they're like, oh, like liberal tears. Like, we see the left use the same tactics that the right does, because the left will post a mug that says liberal tears, and then you'll see Steven Crowder with the same mug that says liberal tears. And then even with Richard Wolff during the Destiny debate, when he claimed that society has not progressed any further than the 1930s under FDR, where fundamentally that is so
bad of a statement to even make. It shows almost like a class reductionist take on the term of Richard Wolff, because it's like, considering the fact that since the 1930s, even into the 60s, we've had a lot of socially progressive qualities that happened underneath of our so-called very bad, horrible, evil, good, evil, no good liberal economy. Like the elimination of slavery in general fell underneath of what we'd consider liberal economies. The United Kingdom, as far as I was aware, is the first country to actively try to eliminate slavery within, like, at least the home islands. We obviously know that you bastards sure kept that around in India for. Actually, it's still going on in India, so I can't blame all of it on you guys. But in the 60s, we had the first passage of acts that would that integrated schools. We had the first acts that brought women, at least technically, on par with men in the workplace, and that continued into the 70s. We had reforms against child labor. We had retaliation laws. We had the first codified minimum working wage. Like, there's a lot of things that people will say, and then they'll just use it as a dunk. So that's pretty much why I was like, all right, I'm going to go fucking liberal here, and then also talk about how fundamentally Richard Wolff is wrong about how there's no actual progressive policies, because he's focused on the economics of something, but the thing is that socially is more concerning for me than economically.
I don't disagree that liberal societies have made progressive changes or transformations, although they can't make sufficient transformations that are necessary because it'll compromise the inherent structure and mode of organization of a liberal society. As far as, I just think social and economics is a false dichotomy, because I think that these things play in conjunction with one another. I think that, for example, when we're talking about trans liberation, we can't separate the economic from the state-based oppression. When we're talking about Black liberation, we can't separate the economic and state-based forms of oppression. I think that they play in conjunction with one another. Their character is it helps mold the character when they interact with one another. And so I just reject that dichotomy in general. I don't disagree with anything you said. I think that I don't disagree with, like, the substance on really any significant degree.
Oh, internet's gone a bit.
I was gonna say, is my internet being shit, or is it
or
Zoom
even
or this-
on. Oh, is it me? Sorry. Can you hear me now?
Yeah, perfect.
Yep, can you hear now?
Yeah, right. So the only disagreement is I reject the dichotomy of social and economic, and I think it's undeniable that liberal policies have reformed the economy and social structures, although it's just not sufficient, because in order for us to have complete emancipation, in order to bring to fruition the values that liberal society claims and proclaims to be what we should adhere to, we need a negation of that existing order and system. So that's all I'd say to that.
What I would say is that fundamentally, even if we were to go to an anarchist society, because I know that you reject the idea of a transitional state, because I watched it and I tried to get a certain percentage of like what your takes were versus the overall like left anarchist Twitter takes that people have, and tried to synthesize like arguments or at least criticisms of specific things that I've heard. But the idea that we're going to have trans liberation now, and we're not going to have racism against Black people to such a degree. The reason why we have so many states passing laws about trans people, for example, is the fact that there are just a lot of people who are bigoted out there, and no matter what system that you have, without proper education or informed learning on these people, you are still going to have a society that now is completely ran and dictated by them, but also they have more power to sort of fuck you over. So it's a double-edged sword in that kind of way. Whereas the government itself can pass laws by saying like, oh, the Civil Rights Act does in fact count when it comes to transgender individuals. So we have a federal law saying that yes, you cannot discriminate against trans people. So it's like, ideally, like, if you just convert it strictly into like a social run commune, then you're just really hoping that everybody in your social run commune is really, really open to the idea of trans people existing or having a fundamental right to exist. Because like I wouldn't want to go start like I wouldn't want to go live in like a commune with like somebody like Jason Unruh or something. Because I'd probably just like fucking one of us would end up like fucking choked.
Right. So that goes into what I said earlier, right? About a revolution needs to be all encompassing. It can't really be singular faceted. It has to be multifaceted to address the various structural means in which exploitation and oppression takes place. That goes into cultural hegemony and the need to have a coherent movement against that cultural hegemony. As far as, government, the problem with yielding government power for trans people or black people or etc. is that it's very conditional. The power and the rights, or I shouldn't even say rights, the liberation of, not even liberation, the power and, the security of marginalized communities is conditional upon a alienated state apparatus with a monopoly on violence. And as soon as that state apparatus elects new people with more reactionary and conservative views, it will just lead to once again, the oppression of those marginalized communities on that level again. I think that emancipation and liberation is far more preferable to rights because it's not conditional upon that. It's simply self-assertion, being armed, having power, building communities, and, be strong in marginalized communities. I think that as far as, these governments taking away people's rights and so forth, I think that look at the economic exploitation that goes on. Trans people being kicked out of their homes from their parents. That's largely a product of a nuclear family that when you look at it from an anthropological level is largely a product of the stratified mode of production. When you look at the discrimination on the economic sector that goes on of queer people, oftentimes curtailing government policy. And when you look at the way in which economic exploitation even affects these marginalized communities on such a profound level, when you look at the fact that the police, which is the wing of the state apparatus, it exists largely to protect private property relations. And look at the way in which when these revolts are going on, you see police protecting a target while their own precinct is getting burnt down. That happened once in Minneapolis. It's just, you have to look at these structures on a multifaceted level, and you have to look at how they coalesce rather than looking at them on a dichotomy-based analysis. I think that's the problem.
Okay, so real quick question: when you say capitalist exploitation of trans people, do you mean like gay coding, or like targeting products specifically at trans people, or like the need for, or the need and push for services that are now informed consent over the internet that pop up and charge people significantly more than hospitals do for that kind of thing?
I think surplus. I just mean surplus value extraction. I think that those issues have a exclusively social. I don't look at this as like affecting all people the same. I think that there is even empirical studies that demonstrate how in workplaces Black people are like they're treated on a different level than other marginalized communities. And I think it goes on the economic sphere, it goes on the social sphere. These things are, they coalesce. They're not like exclusionary in their nature.
Yeah, and I also think that too, in the workplace, depending on exactly how like racist the workplace is, depends immensely on the region and the type of work that you're doing. Like a factory is most likely to be more racist, at least from my experience of working there. I know that internal surveys at Amazon, I don't know if they're going to be leaked or not, have shown that there's a massive amount of transphobia and racism against Mexican workers and trans people. So the thing is that we need to figure out a codified way of making sure that, well, the company policies, for example, at say Amazon, fund everything all the way up to gender reassignment surgery and vocal surgeries. The thing is that while you can get that from the company, and the company is offering those for essentially free, it's the actual people within that system, or that are within that specific center, that are the ones doing the actual bigotry. It's not the company itself. The company's semi allowing it to happen, but they still don't want to be out. Like, they still want to get a bad mark for somebody going to the media. Look at what happened when one trans person got fired from Amazon went to the media and suddenly they had an entire class devoted to trans rights just to give to people. Did anybody learn anything from it? Probably not. But the thing about capitalism is that everybody's always going to want to save face, and it's also going to try to offer the best incentives for people as well. At least in my opinion. Like, the fact of the matter is that we could talk about like healthcare in terms of like Medicare for all, but then we argue essentially statistics of like, okay, well, such and like so many amount of people support Medicare for all. It's like, well, what exactly do they mean by Medicare for all? Because most studies are worded in such a way where it's like, do you support like a subsidized healthcare? So it's like when they say that and they say yes, it could mean like opt-in pay and things like that. So obviously, companies offering health insurance, I don't think is a bad thing, and I don't think that companies offering exclusive services to people like me who are transgender is explicitly bad. I think that what it comes down to is the fact that most people still have their own biases which they bring to work, which I mean is not like a revolutionary new idea. So it's more we need to bring people socially up to date with the policies that we have.
So you don't think that the social stratification that's a product of capitalism and class structures and so forth, you don't think that has an effect on the alienation and the lack of being able to recognize the plights of trans people and other marginalized communities? Do you also not think that you're essentially integrating marginalized communities into a system of exploitation when you're appealing to them and marketing to them? You're not effectively liberating them in its totality. And you also have to consider that you're essentially preventing marginalized communities from having more power by affirming, because these people are giving it to you. These capitalists are giving it to you. The state is giving you your rights and your health care and so forth. It's essentially leaving you in a vulnerable position as a marginalized community that a significant contingent of the population despises, and it can be taken from you. It has been before. State policy shifts in terms of how much power trans people have. Why not complete empowerment? Why not complete liberation? I don't think that capitalism can effectively calibrate, the necessities for that condition to arise. So that would be my response to that.
My response would be, again, we're going back to the idea that anarchism is going to completely liberate trans people, and that despite the fact that you've just essentially said that yes, people have their own inherent biases, that when you go into an anarchist society, these biases aren't going to show up. Like if a racist community suddenly decides to become a entirely co-op run community, it's still going to be a racist community.
So like I said earlier, a revolt against structures require a multifaceted analysis. You cannot have revolution without an intersectional coalition in this day and age, especially. I think that's a critical aspect that we can't leave out. I don't think that there's this myth about conservative co-op societies. I just don't think that these things will be able to coalesce and form in the first place, given the existing conditions. And I'd argue with you that anarchism at least sets the preconditions for a complete emancipation for marginalized communities, whereas that possibility doesn't even arise within a capitalist mode of production and a capitalist system of distribution and framework. I'd argue that, that would probably be my points.
Well, I was going to say that liberalism also offers emancipation for trans people, just by the fact that it reinforces by law the nature that we have a right to exist. So that's the thing that I'm talking about, and especially when it comes to companies which are amazingly huge, reaffirming the idea that they will pay for you to go through the necessary procedures to it. So I think that both ways have their own certain ways of affirming that people exist.
They will pay for their procedures, but as soon as a culture, I don't believe in the Steven Pinker, notion that there's a linear. My camera fell off.
It's okay.
It's all good.
Culture, live existence.
Sorry, the internet was totally shot there. So just restate what you said.
Yeah, right. So I don't think the foundational issue is that liberalism perpetuates a state apparatus. That state apparatus can be, taken over by people with new ideological dispositions, and it can easily erode the progress that's been made by marginalized communities. It essentially makes marginalized communities reliant upon alienated structures rather than giving them the complete capacity for emancipation. So the preconditions for a liberated marginalized community isn't there. It's great that a corporation gives trans people healthcare, but I don't think that trans people should, I don't think that trans people ought to be reliant upon oppressive structures in order to have the basic necessities. I think that they should have it guaranteed through mutual aid systems, through empowerment, through having power just as much as anybody else in a community or a society. And as far as the pre-existing biases are concerned, yes, pre-existing biases exist, but it's a duality. Okay, we want structures and modes of organization that appeals to the pre-existing biases that are most favorable to a well-organized and well-knit society. I don't believe human beings are naturally great. I don't even subscribe to Kropotkin's thesis that human beings are naturally more good, and they desire to help each other. I think human nature is a pure duality, and I think that structures that best facilitate the desirable characteristics are the best ones. And I think that liberal capitalism fails to accomplish what it sets out to accomplish. Yeah.
Real quick, can I ask exactly what it is that you mean by multifaceted revolution?
Yeah, sure. So I don't believe in a revolution that isn't oriented around, the sort of social issues that face our time. So I believe in, tackling the cultural hegemony that exists to oppress marginalized communities, that exist also to reinforce the exploitation of capital. And I think that we need to bring people in from Black Lives Matter, and we need to, incorporate the trans struggle and these various struggles to have a truly liberatory, emancipatory project. I don't think even it should come up, the existence of this revolt that leads to a racist cooperative, because then you haven't really you haven't listened to the past. You haven't properly articulated how a genuine socialist revolution comes to fruition. That is a failure on the part of the revolutionary and the movement that's trying to bring to fruition these goals. So that would just be a failing if that's what came to being, to be honest.
So when you say multifaceted, what you really mean is intersectional revolution.
Right.
Okay. The one thing that I will say about that is that there's a lot of there's a lot of people that like to you signaled the idea of there being like a way that there wouldn't be a racist community, and a lot of people like to point to people like Huey Long in the 1930s as being like this great emancipator for Black people in Louisiana, but then immediately forget that Huey Long, once he was in the Senate, voted against an anti-lynching bill. So any sort of time that we have particular ways of people to gain power, be it by council vote or be it in an actual democratic place, people are going to take advantage of that. Because remember, the Soviets were considered to be worker consuls, and yet they still had a fundamental gap where they were able to be exploited just by forming alliances within themselves. So you either have complete run amokism, or you have, in my opinion, consoles where people just effectively fall back into essentially politics. Like even Bakunin in the Revolutionary Catechism said that society would be organized in such a way that every nation would be a autonomous region within a collective world, which basically just sounds like you're trying to do the world that we have now, but with more stuff.
So, of course, I'm not going to stay true to or, uphold every statement made by Bakunin in his catechisms or in any of his writings. As far as, Huey Long is concerned, I agree with you that there's a misrepresentation, particularly by Nazbols and, more people that are more willing and open to reactionary conservatives, to misrepresent what he did in terms of bringing it. He didn't bring in reactionary racists into his movement. That's a complete mischaracterization. He didn't bring in white people that were, anti-Black into his movement. I completely agree with that. And I think that that's a proper way in which we revolt against systems of organization and oppression. I don't think that people have to be racist. I don't think this is a general. I don't think that people have to be, as bigoted as they are today. I think that's not like a natural immutable law. I think that can be mitigated based on, a sort of growing consciousness about, realizing our common oppression, understanding our common humanity. I don't think that this is asinine to propose such a thing. As far as the Soviet Union is concerned, yeah, there was a reactionary politics, underlying, what happened there. And I'd argue that there wasn't a Marxist intersectionality that was underpinning Lenin. However, I will say this. I will say that, what the Soviet Union achieved in terms of racial, awareness about, oppression, what it achieved in terms of women's rights, it's far significantly superior to its capitalist counterparts that existed there. But to me, that's not even that relevant, because I don't see the Marxist analysis of oppression that Lenin subscribed to. I don't subscribe to his particular conception of materialism. So like, it isn't even that relevant to me, but I would point that out.
Okay, so we're kind of at the end of our lot of time, so I'll start to wrap things up. I'll just give each of you a chance to make any final points you want to make. Moirai, I'll give you the first opportunity. So, what are your final kind of words on the topic at hand? And then just shout yourself out.
Okay. My final topic at hand. Sorry, I just got a message from Eris about the stream that I'm going on. So my final topic at hand is that I've always said that liberalism is fine. Classic French-style liberalism, where we get the left-right dichotomy from, has always been fine. The thing is that we need systems that actually have safety nets built into them. We need to make sure that everybody in society is taken care of. So that's where I mostly try to come from with this. Now, I oppose anarchism because there's so many different variants that people want to talk that it seems like a movement like this is destined to fail, no matter how intersectional or multifaceted it becomes. And also, it seems to be less favorable than it does with, say, offering market incentives like profit sharing or free college. So there's some arguments that we could make about, like, how do we get to a society where capitalism is healthier for us to do it? And it's like, well, obviously we could do things like cap and trade, or we could try to curb our extensive reliance on resources without fully reverting to things like degrowth, which is just anprim, but for people who are too afraid to say that they're anprim. And that's all I really wanted to say. Also, it's sort of just been, it's really hard to attack Zoomer, because it's like, yesterday was her birthday, and also like she's a really good friend, and we just happened to like disagree on one little subject. We're like, all right, we're going to debate this. So it sort of came up from that, and I'm glad that, Chud was at least welcome, or at least welcoming to hear us sit here and just sort of yell at each other about semantics, pretty much.
Yeah, no, I'm always up for hosting a debate. It's as long as everyone behaves themselves, I don't have to do very much, so that's always good.
Oh yeah, I save all the blood sports for the tomfoolery panel, because it's really hard for me to not yell at people. So I'm trying to like find like the best way to not just be full like madstiny. So yes.
Okay, cool. Do you want to shout yourself out as well?
Yeah, you can follow me on Twitch. I am NeoMoirai on Twitch. I am at on Twitter. I am at OmniFeudalism, which, if you check it out... Oh, I think that you spelled Moirai wrong.
I just did it again. Oh, for fuck's sake. Don't worry about that. I'll fix it. I'll do it, okay?
It's all right. And also, if, like, I haven't been checking chat. I'm sure I'm going to browse through it and see things. Everybody does it where it's like, holy shit, like, I should have brought this point up. I should have mentioned that. I should have done this. So I'm going to scroll through there and read the criticisms in there. Follow me on Twitter, get all my hot-based takes, anything like that. And also, Moirai is not Japanese. Everybody likes to assume that it's Japanese. It's actually Greek. It means, it's actually the three daughters of Zeus, who represent fate. So, and then Neo just comes from the fact that I used to play on the Neo forums when I was a big StarCraft player. Jesus Christ, I just sound like a trans horrible social interaction destiny. Jesus Christ.
It's all good. Okay, Zoomer Nation. Final thoughts. Shout yourself out.
Yeah, sure. I'll just conclude by, mentioning something Marx said when he was being censored by the Prussian, media and newspapers and so forth. That freedom is the very essence of man. That even its enemies try to realize it. Sometimes they want freedom for themselves and not others, and sometimes we seek a complete emancipatory project. But the power of freedom is just an immutable aspect of mankind. And I'm not a humanist because I don't believe in species centrism, but I do believe in the Marxist, valuation of freedom and liberty. And I think liberalism fails to, recognize its own values and principles. I think that, you can only strive to achieve complete emancipation through an anarchist framework, through an intersectional rejection of hierarchy and oppression. And that would be my closing statements. As far as, where you can find me, Zoomer Nation is my YouTube channel. It's pretty based. Check it out. I have a Twitter. You can just search up Zoomer Nation. You'll probably find it on Twitter, or at Sarma/Aaliyah. That's my Twitter handle. And yeah, that would be it. Thanks, Chud, for hosting this debate.
No worries. Thanks very much. Thanks for coming on and providing content. It's been great. Thanks for the interesting conversation. And I'll speak to you both soon, I'm sure. All right?
All right.
All right.
Thanks.
Also,
bye.
audience, I was going to say, audience, just be safe. Know that I love you no matter your feelings on me or my belief that capitalism is good if we plan certain things out. And Zoomers, stay safe, be cool. I know that you're in a state right now that just got rid of masks for everybody. So just be careful out there, okay?
Everyone be careful. Good advice.
Yeah, of
Okay.
course. Thank you.
Bye.